This is an index that was created to measure the sustainability of trade. Sustainability is a word here that is commonly associated with in the ESG context, but what it really means is, in our context, how trade can be geared on the basis of making for greater mutual benefit and openness rather than just in the ESG sense alone. The Heinrich IMD Sustainable Trade Index covers 73 indicators. They range from everything from your current account to societal indicators such as the evenness of development, social mobility, carbon intensity, and a range of indicators covering 30 economies that judge how well each of them have adapted. And it's particularly relevant this year as we head into very volatile times. A few housekeeping rules before we kick off. One is that we do have a chat function wherever you guys are tuning in from all over the world. This is something that you could use to ask questions as we go. We'll try and reserve 10 minutes toward the end. This is a recorded session. We may not be able to get to all your questions, but certainly we'll try. And with me today, I have four very distinguished panelists, led by really someone who could very well be described as the architect of the Heinrich IMD Sustainable Trade Index, Christos Kabonis, who is the chief economist at IMD, and he also writes an illustrious resume that includes the International Center for Finance at the Yale School of Management. He has been published in Review of Financial Studies, the Journal of Law. He taught at Santa Barbara and UNC. We also have Simon Evenet, who is now Professor of Geopolitics and Strategy at IMD, but may be better known to some of us as the founder of Global Trade Alert and its sister Digital Policy Alert, which for many of us are the anchor for the data, the real data scraping that involves close trade analysis. Simon, of course, also has served for the World Bank, the UK Competition Commission, and too many things to mention here. Along with him, we have Richard Baldwin, who is Professor of International Economics, also at IMD, and the author of books such as The Great Convergence and the Globotics Upheaval. He comes from a pedigree, one of which is non-tariff barriers, non-tariff measures. Also, he really chose to focus on trade after a very crucial meeting with Paul Krugman. We can get him to talk more about it, perhaps on another occasion. And joining them is Deborah Elms, who is Head of Trade Policy at the Heinrich Foundation. And prior to joining us at the foundation, Debbie had an illustrious career as the founder of the Asian Trade Center, very well known, and was the president of associations with so many acronyms as ABTA, the ADCF, she was at APCO, the World Economic Forum. Again, it's a whole jumble of acronyms, much too long to list out here. So these are the four panelists that we have with us today. And we are going to address the issue of whether we have been on a losing streak as far as sustainable trade is concerned this year. This is an important question, obviously, because we're in a time of transition, and we are going to find out how the index has changed this year and how the index itself is adapting this year. And here to walk us through the findings, Christos, over to you.
Thank you, Ching-Wei. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on which part of the world you are right now. It is really very exciting for us to present the fourth edition of the Sustainable Trade Index. And as Wei said, essentially, what we mean by sustainable is literally, we take it in a literal sense, that trade sustain itself over time, delivering mutual benefits, delivering openness, adaptability, and trust. So in a sense, STI was designed with this idea in mind. How economies create the conditions for trade to endure. And in order to measure that, we evaluate 30 different economies that engage in sustainable trade. The majority of the trading blocks are in Asia Pacific and Oceania, where these 30 economies are members of, and they include really advanced leaders like Singapore, Japan, but also UK, New Zealand, but also emerging powers. China, of course, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Mexico. And geographically, I'm giving you an idea of where these economies hold. And these economies, 30 in number, actually have more than 2/3, they produce more than 2/3 of the global GDP, and they have more than 60% of the total population of the world. So what we try to do is we try to measure these STI, the economies in the STI, by using 72 criteria across 3 different pillars: the economic capability, the societal performance, and the environmental stewardship. And I will very briefly show the ranking for this year. And you can see number 1, United Kingdom, New Zealand is 2nd, Singapore, Australia 3rd, Singapore 4th, and South Korea 5th. What I would like to point for our discussion is that we see a very wide performance gap, starting with 100 for United Kingdom, and Myanmar in the 30th position with 0. But also, we see a paradox. And the paradox is that identical performance in different criteria essentially may imply different strategies for the economies that follow that. So what is different for this year? Essentially, what we see is that the main background that the trade was based, the global trade model was based in the last more than 3 decades, that essentially was related to openness, efficiency, and multilateralism, is actually breaking down. So we see supply chains that are being re-engineered. We see trade agreements that are becoming more exclusive, and even similar scores in traditional criteria like openness may result in completely, drastically different strategies for the countries that have them. So what we, in addition to using STI, as we always did, as a benchmark, where economies can compare and contrast, find best practices, and see what it can be done, we actually try structure an interpretation of our results around 3 trade-offs. We ask, how much efficiency are we willing to sacrifice in order to gain control over critical resources and technologies? This is the first trade-off. The second trade-off tries to see, can countries keep benefiting from open markets without eroding the social trust and equity that make trade politically viable? And thirdly, we try to understand whether global environmental goals can coexist with national growth aspirations, especially in the developing world. So we think that we are moving from the area of resilience to the area of realignment. By resilience, we mean what we studied in the past. Resilience is about redundancy, multiple suppliers, different routes. Realignment is repositioning, is picking up partners, building domestic capacity, deciding that certain areas that trade was existing in the past may actually not exist anymore. So let me very, very briefly walk you through one of these trade-offs, namely the trade-off between efficiency and autonomy. You see that we try to understand what exactly is going on between high tariffs and low tariffs, as well between high liberalization and low liberalization. And we see, for instance, in the low tariffs, high liberalization, in the open market leaders, countries as different as Peru, New Zealand, and Chile. While in the high tariff area, low liberalization, we see countries that try to build the internal, sustainable, and sufficient way of progressing. And these are India, China, and Bangladesh. We will speak a lot more about this, and I would like to let you with this understanding about what sustainable trade is. Actually, sustainable trade is not a destination. It is a process of adaptation, which implies that continuity is organic. So this year, instead of going across the index and try to determine who is number 1 and who is number 5, actually the real question is no longer who leads the ranking, but what are we losing and gaining from this transition from resilience to realignment. Thank you very much. Swingway, back to you.
Thank you, Christos. And when we talk about the process of adaptation, what we're really talking about, as you say, as you correctly identify, are trade-offs. And I had a very interesting conversation earlier today with someone from the conference board talking about China exports. You know, we expect to see a surge of it, and the sort of popular narrative is that it's going to hit both developed and developing economies, and at some point the tariffs will go up worldwide. And we sort of probed that a little bit, and we found that, well, that may not be uniformly true. And certainly at which point in time is it going to be, and in which segments? Those are the sort of things that we were sort of finessing in that conversation, and which you address in some of the topics that you have raised. And in introducing this session, I realized that I made a trade-off myself. I was so eager to sort of get into the subject that I forgot to introduce myself as Trinwei Yap. I'm the research director for the Hinrich Foundation, and Hinrich Foundation is a philanthropy that works on advancing sustainable global trade. I thought I should just get that out of the way before we pivot back to the real stuff, which is a question that has been on my mind for a while, because I've been on a number of calls that involve both the WTO and the IMF, and in IMF in particular, the revisions to global growth has been quite aggressive compared to April, upward. So we seem to be ending the year on a good note, and even the projection for 2026 is quite rosy, all things considered. That's not how they felt, just 6 months ago. And a lot of the macro indicators that we had expected and many had warned about, including inflation, including exports, haven't quite panned out. So, I just wanted to know, I mean, perhaps Richard, you might want to have a go at this. Were we all wrong? On you're on mute. Actually,
Okay, there we
everyone
go.
can unmute. You're right.
Hey,
Yeah.
thank you for that. So what I'd like to do is share a couple slides to make an argument. There are some facts that I think are important. By the way, Simon has done some studies on this trade deflection and which products it's likely to happen in. So maybe he can weigh in on, like, whether it's really a big issue or not. But let me just share a couple slides. First of all, I'd like to just point out that I have written a book in May called The Great Trade Hack, which talks about this thing. That QR code is, you can download it for free. It was an instant book, mostly putting together the things I do every Friday on LinkedIn, talking about this stuff for more than a year now. But to get to the point about why hasn't the world fallen apart, I'm going to draw on two of the Factful Fridays that I wrote. One in August 29, America walked off the pitch. Why didn't the world trade game end? And the one I wrote on September 5th, which is why haven't Trumpian tariffs done more damage? And I want to basically the why the world trade game didn't end is because the protectionism of the United States, the rampant disregard of any trade promise ever made, that didn't spread. As it turns out, the US only accounts for 15% of world trade. And it turns out that the countries who account for the other 85% like the world trade system as it is, more or less. The rules-based world trading system, multilaterally oriented, is something most countries in the world like. And even though the US has started to act in this very historic way, the rest of the world hasn't followed suit. So that's the first thing. Apart from China, almost nobody's even retaliated against the United States. But then what I want to make a more direct point on the actual versus the headline tariffs. So those simulations that the IMD did and a number of others, they were taking quite extreme forms of fragmentation. Like some of the simulations in the papers, not necessarily the forecast, said there would be no trade between China and the US, for example. But when you look at what actually happened, if you read the headlines, it's very scary. There's 50% tariff here and 20% tariff there. But if you look at the actual numbers here, for example, the partner import shares that are exempted. For here, if you said the partner percent of the world imports, that's 100%, almost a little over 40% are exempted from the tariffs. So quite a lot of the US imports really aren't affected. Now, if you look at that by partner, if you look at the EU, quite a lot of it's exempted. Mexico, huge amounts exempted. China, not less, and Canada, less. So let me just say that Mexico, Canada, a lot of it's exempted through USMCA. And so the tariffs haven't been as impactful as you did. So if we look at the headline tariffs and the actual tariffs, which are effective tariff rates, you can see for the EU, they're relatively similar, 12 versus 15%. But for Mexico, the headline is something like 25%, but the actual average applied is only 5%. And the same for Canada, it's about 35% is the headline, but only 6% is applied because most of it's exempted. So to a certain extent, the damage hasn't been as big as you'd imagine because the US headlines are a lot scarier than what they actually did. So that's, I think, the big point. And I'll just stop right there.
Okay. Well, thank you, Richard. I do want to hear from Simon on trade deflection, but before that, because we're asking the question, what are we losing? And I know, Debbie, you've written a lot about this as well. And if we were to sort of take the point that Richard has just made about actual versus headline, the presumption might be that, well, we haven't really lost that much, or have we? What do you think?
I think we have lost quite a bit. I mean, I think the challenge is that the data at the moment is less scary, perhaps, than I think it will become, in part because while Richard has, I think, very smartly illustrated how many headline tariffs are not actually applied, many of those exempted products are increasingly less exempted. And as the US moves from using reciprocal tariffs under this statute called IEEPA into other kinds of approaches like Section 232 for national security purposes. And eventually, I expect we'll move towards Section 301, which is an even bigger bazooka, if you will, of trade policy. We may find that the tariff coverage actually goes up and is much more impactful than it has been so far. And so I think we're at the early stages of this. But I would agree with Richard's larger point, which is, although the US has clearly made a decision about the way in which it attempts to deal with global trade partners in ways that is really unprecedented over the last, all of our lifetimes, honestly. What I think is a challenge, is a reassuring issue at the moment, is that no one else has followed the US lead yet. I think the key for me is also the word yet.
Right.
So far, we haven't had a lot of retaliation against the United States. And so far, we haven't had that many other countries that have imposed restrictions, especially tariff restrictions, against other trading partners. But it could be that we're at the early stages of this and we haven't seen it yet. And one of the things that we're watching, which I think is a nice segue back over to Simon, is how much of the trade that used to go to the United States that is no longer going to the United States will be adjusted and sent to new markets. Now, that is not, and I think this is a key point as well, not just Chinese trade. It could be trade from lots of different highly competitive firms that used to have access to the US market that either no longer have that access to the US market, or the cost is simply too high with the tariffs in place, that are going to pivot and look for new markets. And as those firms pivot, and again, it's not just Chinese firms, it will be really competitive, say Vietnamese firms, Cambodian textile producers, whatever, that could put additional pressure in places that haven't yet experienced this kind of inbound goods trade that may themselves respond in, I'm worried, by putting up trade barriers of one kind or another. Could be tariffs, could be non-tariff issues. We could have retaliation. So far, it's all been in trade and goods. It could move into trade and services. We're having more and more challenges around export restrictions and export controls. So I think, again, for me, this is the early stages of looking at this adjustment from the past practices on trade to whatever is likely to come ahead. And so, although the data at the moment is both worrying and reassuring, I suspect as we go forward, we may find more to worry about than we're currently having as we sit here in October of 2025.
Yeah, no, yeah, so certainly. I mean, that sort of panoply of trade weapon statutes, all kinds of export controls that are new and are being innovated and that are being reinvented in some cases. Some of them are just being debuted in ways that we have not seen before. That ratcheting effect. In all the rosy projections that I've seen, they are all heavily caveated. All these agencies are saying, yes, but, and this is a good point, I guess, to pivot to Simon.
Let me start by saying I endorse what my colleagues have said about this. We are in the middle of this process. It's a bit like watching an English rugby game and not knowing what the outcome is. And you never do in the English rugby team, because it all can often go wrong in the last 5 minutes. So it's a little bit, we're predicting far ahead of the outcome. I want to endorse something Richard said, which is that there is a huge difference between the announced rates and the effective rates of tariffs in the US, and the US effective tariff rates are much less now than what was threatened in April. So according to the Yale Budget Lab, in early April, we were looking at effective rates of 28%, and now that's down to 17.9%. Now, as you learnt in your first econ class, the damage done by tariffs is according to the square of the size of the tariff. So cutting the effective tariff rate from 28 to 18 actually reduces the amount of damage done by about 60%. And so that's why I think we're seeing much less. Now, of course, going forward, we have all sorts of things could happen, but there's very good reasons why this has worked out less badly than people had hoped. And partly that was a deliberate decision of the US administration to allow foreign countries to buy down their tariff rates by making all sorts of other problems. Now, turning to looking forward, the question of trade deflection, yes, the share exported by China to the United States, or sorry, the share of China's exports going to the US has fallen quite a lot this year compared to the same period last year, but it's ending up in essentially three markets: ASEAN, Africa, except South Africa, and some for Latin America, maybe a little bit in India. Certainly not in the European Union. In the European Union, we do not see an increase in the share of Chinese exports overall going to the EU. We do see in some products, such as steel, an increase. So it could be localized. And that, I think, leads to another point that connects to what Debbie has said, which is that the response in many countries is likely to be localized to import surges rather than the across-the-board measures that the United States has taken. Which brings me to sort of my final point, which is that what is new this year is a whole-scale revision in US tariff policy, not the surgical types of tariff policy. We are seeing across the board increases in tariffs. That has not yet been copied by other countries, and let's hope that stays the case. But still, the uncertainty that this shock has engendered to the system is itself a massive tax on investment and on trade. And that is what is freezing the economies at the moment and slowing growth down, maybe not to the degree that we expected in April, but as I said, that's because the US tariff shock has been smaller in practice than was announced at the time.
Yeah.
Can I jump in just on that point that Deborah and Simon were making, to sort of add another thing, is that although there is this cascading protection that happens when trade gets deflected, which leads to an import surge, which leads to dumping duties, etc., there's also domino liberalization. And one of the amazing things is the number of free trade agreements that had been lingering for years that got signed in the last 6 months. So not only is there a tendency towards some sporadic, as Simon said, localized reaction to deflected Chinese exports, the loss of the American market is getting people excited to sign trade agreements that were very difficult to do before, UK, India, for example, or Brazil, China. Now, can I show one more slide here on what we lost? I think we also, there's another point I'd like to add in here, I got this, no, I want the PowerPoint. Here we go. So the idea is, what have we really lost? Or the question is, and what I think the big thing we lost is leadership. The trade system has no leader now. So Trump started the post-US trade leadership era, and you see on the left there, before there was US stewardship of the world trading system, and it become more hesitant after the global financial crisis, but at least it was there. Now there's nothing, and there's no clear leader who's ever going to take over. So in my mind, the big thing is the trading system has lost a leader. But I want to make two other points about this isn't turning out the way that potentially the Trump administration thought it was. And this goes to my October 17th one, is the US rebalancing its trade or retreating from trade? And if you look at here, this big graphic, is the US is closing off. So this is blue line is the share of US world exports. And you can see it's now down below where it was when Trump took office. And its share of world imports, less surprisingly, is also down. So what the US is doing now is closing itself off. And when you look at this other chart, this is the world has moved on. The blue is the rest of the world exports to the rest of the world. And as you can see, it is now going back up, whereas US exports to the world are going down. So to a certain extent, I can see a world where what is happening is reglobalization without America. I think there's some evidence for that. I am an optimist compared to Simon's realism, but that's my optimistic take.
Yeah. No,
if I may bring
Christos.
Yeah, if I may bring something just to connect, I think that definitely we are losing leadership. I would agree with both what Debbie and Simon brought very eloquently, but the loss of leadership essentially implies that we are losing strategic legibility. And this can be seen from the STI ranking. So for instance, we have loss of convergence. Think about Singapore and Korea, both Tiger model origin companies, countries. Now, Singapore doubles down on openness, and Korea actually uses different industrial policies in order to secure the basis that it wants for self-sufficiency. And also, going back to what Richard just said, we have an institutional fracture, right? I mean, think about United States, Australia, and United Kingdom, all three countries part of our ranking, all of them Anglo, rules-based, and all of them going in completely different directions. So essentially, the convergence that used to be something that we were observing in the past, this has broke down.
Right. Well, if I were to play devil's advocate, the system that we were converging on, and in fact had converged on, and more or less stayed in place for the last 30 years in terms of multilateral trade, had deepening fissures in it that needed to be fixed anyway. And in this loss of leadership, undoubtedly true, completely agree with Richard on it. And if we were to sort of strip the personalities involved out of it, and we ask ourselves the question, was this in fact perhaps necessary, this shock to the system, to address what do we value? What do we prioritize? So the nations that value it would double down on openness, as Christoph said. Singapore is one of them. The nations that see value in the institutions that underpin multilateralism would double down on that. And the United States, which has really thrown this banner into the works, may take some time to come back. It's possible. We don't know. That's the big we don't know. But the question is, was this perhaps necessary?
Oh, I don't know whether it's necessary. I leave it to the gentleman on the panel to talk about that part. But let me just describe the challenges that we've seen in one country in particular this week, just to give a sort of, up-to-date flavor. So let's think about Malaysia. Malaysia is chair of ASEAN. At this time of great trade disruption, here we have a region that is outward focused on trade, facing an increasingly protectionist US for sure, and some challenges elsewhere. This could be the moment in which ASEAN unifies and addresses this as a bloc, vis-a-vis particularly the United States. That is not what happened. Instead, what happened is that ASEAN went after the US, or went to discuss this with the US one-on-one, and Malaysia just signed off this week on a deal that is politely put one-sided and not in favor of Malaysia. So it had to deal with both its ASEAN chairmanship and trying to push this organization forward. Bilaterally, it signed on to an agreement with the United States that is going to create real challenges, I think, for Malaysia going forward, especially in its relations with others, including its other major trading partners. But while it did all of that, it had another interesting outcome, which literally just happened, which is the signing of the China-ASEAN free trade upgrade. This is the third time that they've upgraded this. So to me, what this is showing in one country in this region is the complexity of the landscape that you now operate in. You're working, you've always worked, of course, regionally, globally, and bilaterally, but I think the tensions and the pressures in different directions is really becoming very hard for many countries to manage, because you're being pushed and pulled in very different directions. You're being asked to sign on to commitments in one area that may limit your flexibility in others. You're being pushed by the two major trading partners, especially in this part of the world in Asia, to respond in ways that are maybe not in your own domestic best interest, but how do you sort of balance that? And I think the reason why, to me, we're at the early stages of figuring out where we're headed is exemplified by the problems that Malaysia is facing this week alone in Southeast Asia, trying to navigate whatever sort of, world that we're moving into.
Right. Yeah, brute force has sort of become a player in a way that it never has before. It's highly unpredictable, and it converges more with security in the end, which ends up suborning greater measures of efficiency. Very interesting issue about the deflection that actually didn't go to EU, Simon.
Can I come in on this?
Yeah.
On this question, you asked, was this shock necessary? I think I'd ask the question, necessary for whom? Because I think the countries are going to come at this in different ways, and this builds a very strong link to the contents of the report, which argues that there are different development pathways the countries are following. If you look at the developments over the last 10 to 20 years of the trading system and see your security being threatened by the rise of another power, which is what essentially enough people in the United States have concluded about China, then you see this rupture as absolutely necessary. But then the question is, does everyone else see it as necessary? And here, I think Debbie's really highlighted the difficult positions that some countries are facing as they face pressures from all of the big players. But I think the message from the report is countries should figure out what is ultimately in their sort of what their long-term development trajectory is, and then ask themselves, how does openness contribute to this in an era when the bigger players are much more worried about security? And I think and then whether a country decides to turn inwards is up to them. I'd be hard pressed to believe that this is generally the right thing to do. I think when I look at the world, I see three groups of countries. One group who is petrified by issues of security, and these are the big players who are worried about the rise of other big players. Then there is a very large number of countries whose lifestyles and living standards are utterly dependent on international trade. You are based in one of them. I'm based in Switzerland, another one of them. And for these countries, what really matters is the question that arises: how can we adapt our approach to openness given security concerns seem to be influencing the behavior of others? And then there are some bigger players who are probably members of the G20, who are not the biggest members of the G20, who will be torn in both directions. And I think so then the question you pose, I would not be surprised if different players answered that differently, whether it was necessary.
Right. Yeah, and you see that playing out not just in the WTO reform efforts, but also in monetary policy. I mean, in finance, in a whole range of global institutions, that same question is being asked, and the question is how big and how deeply rooted Group 2 and its relationships have become
or could become.
Yeah, exactly. Or could become, which is a nice sort of segue to the other issue that we wanted to discuss, which is the strategies that are being adopted. Some of which you can outright say, there's a huge and novel weaponization of trade. I brought up the issue of brute power, and Debbie sort of alludes a lot to this in the summit season that is ongoing in Asia. And what we see at the end of the day is what Christos talks about in the trade-offs between efficiency versus autonomy, profit versus cohesion, climate versus development sovereignty. I mean, these are the things that you give up as you pursue the agenda of Group 1, were you to do so. is there, I mean, when you guys look at Europe, for example, coming back to the point that Simon made, Europe is putting up a lot of defenses. It may not have fully used them yet. I think in some cases they have against China, Chinese exports. But what you see is also a redirection of Chinese exports in the form of FDI in Europe as well. What sort of strategies are you seeing that may be interesting to single out?
Well, let me weigh in a little bit on that. So I want to be a bit more optimistic because I want to focus on what does Donald Trump really want from this whole trade war thing. And in my book, I argued that what he really is pursuing is he's channeled a sense of victimhood of the American middle class and blamed foreigners. So the tariffs are sort of a flare that shoots up and lets his base know that finally somebody in power is standing up for them. Now the trouble is that flare landed on their house and is burning it down. So I think what a lot of countries all around the world have figured out that he is now worried about those tariffs hurting his base. So I don't think they're going to go up very high. I think a lot of the exemptions were because he realized it was hurting them. Blue collar job creation slowing, goods prices are rising. So I think many countries around the world are just, let's wait. He may very well remove them or certainly not pursue them as aggressively. And we'll have to switch on to some other thing to signal that he's standing up for the missing middle class. So I think if you play the man, not the cards, in other words, you ignore that this is actually trade policy, but rather it's some sort of domestic thing going on in the US, it looks a lot less scary. And also you think about it very differently. I wouldn't be surprised at all that this week we get a deal with China and US that leads to removal of some trade barriers, maybe the fentanyl tariffs, for example, because the US needs to have lower prices, less inflation before the midterm elections. It certainly doesn't need a recession, and any kind of kicking off of the trade war could do that.
Yeah, might not be a good time to bring back the quote, what is it? Trade wars are good and easy to win.
So can I come to your point on Europe?
Simon.
Sure. So let's use the report has 3 nice trade-offs. And so I'm going to use that to organize my answer to your question. So when it comes to efficiency versus autonomy, we're clearly seeing the European nations and the European Union prizing autonomy and realizing that their level of over-dependence on some jurisdictions has got to come down, and we will see measures in this regard. When it comes to profitability versus cohesion, here, to be frank, outside of a few pockets, we have low profits and low cohesion. So we can only go up on both of those things. And so there's a serious amount of rethinking needed in European societies on this regard. And then when it comes to climate, you frame it in terms of climate versus development sovereignty for other countries. I would put a framing of to what extent will the EU sacrifice climate goals for other goals, including openness. And I think if push comes to shove, they will back the climate goals. Which leads me to the ultimate conclusion that although the EU's heart is in multilateralism, its actions may take it away from more multilateral principles over time because of the choices that I've just described, especially if they cannot fix the social cohesion problem. I have no problem with them sticking to climate transition goals because I think they're necessary. And if they're trying to fix the autonomy question, I think they'll be doing that. And the pressure on some key industries is going to make them turn inwards. So my central scenario, and it's not the only possible outcome, is that the EU becomes a reluctant fortress rather than an explicitly willing fortress, which is what's happening in North America.
Yeah, that's a great title for a book, Simon. The Reluctant Fortress. I mean, there's a huge number of issues in there. Social cohesion, the stickiness of globalization, in the form of climate, and I think the stickiness of globalization, I mean, that Debbie, a lot of what you were saying raises that as well. But something else is sticky. And I made that, reference to that quote. And again, if we were to sort of strip the personalities out of it, the tariffs that were first imposed in 2018 didn't go away. They stayed. The 232s have been in place for 8 years now. These things don't go away. So that's sticky as well. And that, I suppose, sort of brings us to the policy dilemmas that lie ahead. What we've seen this year is a highly chaotic year. We may be going back, ending the year on a rosy note, but are we going back to liberalization? Are we heading to a landing point that is something of a plateau or just a tipping point for something far riskier? Anyone want to take a stab at it? Yeah,
I'll just say I think it's too early to tell. I don't know where we're going to end up, but I would say I don't think trade is ending. I don't think we're done being interconnected with one another, but I think the format that takes is going to be contested in ways that we haven't seen in a long time. And so how that comes out, I don't know. But while we're talking in this region about what are some of the opportunities, I guess, because Asia always likes opportunities. They're not interested in hearing all the bad news. So let's talk about opportunities for a second. I mean, I suppose the good news about disrupting the global trading system that we've had is that it does give rise to openings for conversations that may not have been possible before, from coalitions of countries that may not have ever come together before, to think about new ideas on the agenda that have been problematic for a long period of time that may now suddenly become far more interesting to more players. And so let me just highlight one, since we sit in Singapore and they're about to launch this next month, this horribly named FITP, Forum on Investment and Trade Partnership, Forum, I think, and not Future, but whatever it is, it's an interesting group. It's a future. The future, whatever it is, we need a new name.
Investment and Trade Partnership.
Yeah, needs a new name. But the point, I think, is still good, which is
Angeles is open to renaming it, by the way.
I'm happy to take suggestions to anyone who will listen.
Right.
This is not 14 smallish countries, smallish. I don't think they would call themselves small, but I'm not sure that you put Singapore and Switzerland in the small category, other than geographically. The point is that they're looking for ways in which 14 smaller countries can come together and pursue some innovative ideas together. Now, what that looks like, again, very early days. It formally launches next month. We don't know the direction they will go. They don't even know. If you ask the 14 members, they all have sort of different ideas of what they'd like to put on the agenda. But what I think is heartening about this FITP and other initiatives like it is that these are members who have seized this opportunity. We have a fragmenting system, not great. Clearly, system that is globally open is better for export-oriented economies. However, let's try to think about how could you, make lemonade out of this by coming together and pursuing different ideas. What those look like, I don't think anyone can say. It's too early. But it shows you that, especially if we have a world without one clear leader at the moment, how else can you get where you want to go? Maybe we do have different coalitions. There are different coalitions of the willing. It pushes that sort of trade-offs narrative that Christos was talking about earlier, where we may have very different arrangements that ultimately lead maybe in the same direction, maybe in opposite directions, but it's very early days in this whole process. And so I think it's, in some ways, it's exciting, because it's new things that we hadn't dealt with. In some ways, it's not exciting, because for all of our careers, we have been built on a sort of, way of doing business and thinking about business that is now undergoing major disruptions.
Yeah. And I know you are tracking it like almost every waking minute. And
if I may,
about a week ago, when we spoke with Richard,
May I add, Chinwe,
Christos,
something?
yes.
I very much sympathize with what Debbie said. And in fact, the way that I also see this kind of small coalitions is that you move from the breakdown we were discussing before, where essentially the main idea is everything is a zero-sum game. Let's see what I can gain, to revisiting possibly win-win situations. And of course, these win-win situations cannot happen with 190 countries at once. They have to happen in a much smaller groups where they provide the flexibility, but also allow members to agree on some things and disagree on others, and therefore bring forth the discussion and build up of the trust, which is the necessary precondition for this kind of agreements, and furthermore for the more open trade to exist.
Yeah. I remember when you and I and Richard were talking last week. Richard, he's got a 20-year view of this, and I was talking about a refocus of reform efforts in the world trading system pre-GFC and post-GFC. Do you want to walk us through that, Richard?
Sure. So if all the people on this call are old enough to remember that the world was moving in a very different direction before the global financial crisis. The world had a problem with updating. There was a global value chain revolution. There was a whole new set of disciplines that were necessary. And because the WTO had lots of people who didn't participate in them, nothing happened there. And then it all went into deep regional trade agreements, originally hub and spoke around Europe, US, and Japan, but then it sort of spread out. And as it started to spread, we got mega regionals. And right at the end there, we had TTIP, which was going to knit the whole Pacific together. And we had TPP, which was going to knit the North Atlantic together. And the US was the key to that whole thing and interested in advancing the reform agenda. So what we were going to have is a WTO 2.0, as I wrote at the time in 2012, I wrote an article like that there would be merging mega regionals, creating a new system. And I wonder if that's not the way the rest of the world moves on, that the RCEPs and the CPTPs, they all kind of merge into a kind of consensus of new rules without the US. So it's globalism, it's multilateralism minus way, if you want. If I can throw in one more thought on the negative side, or the sort of pessimistic side, is one alternative is that we move towards managed trade. And there's already a fair amount of this going on where the US asks people to buy this much and that much. Normally, they never check if they actually buy, so it's kind of a cheap commitment. But in any case, that's what happened when Reagan and when the US and Japan were fighting. They went to managed trade to make sure that the outcomes were fixed. That's not a good one, but I could also see the system slipping a little bit more into like the multi-fiber agreement kind of stuff, where things all get stitched up with bilateral quotas.
And I had just one more suggestion, which is that I think we will also see a different type of trade initiative being put forward, not just FIDP, but a lot more attention to things like trade corridors. Now, in the old days, we probably used to call this stuff trade facilitation, port infrastructure, but I'm heartened by the increasing discussion of key corridors. Many of these corridors seek to link Asia to the Gulf and then to Africa. And I think you'll see I think there will be a parallel discussion on the development of trade, largely not by the trade diplomats, much more by the port companies, transport companies, logistic companies, and associated governments as they try and ease trade in these directions. And I think that particular arc from Africa over to Asia is one which will draw in literally billions of people, and that's an area worth watching carefully.
You're talking about the middle corridor.
Yeah, IMEC and other types of corridors which are being proposed. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. We've got about 3 minutes left. That's a great note to sort of end around. I do want to say, like, some of these ideas have been around for decades, and they have always run into the huge infrastructure costs involved.
Yeah.
And, you know, going paperless, I mean, that's just, you know, that's another huge challenge that the industry has been very resistant to. These are all questions that are going to dog us this year. I don't know, Christos, if you have any final comments to make before we head into closing. You're on mute, Christos.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Wei. I think that what we tried to do this year was actually to go beyond the issue of the scoreboard that STI serves so very nicely in all its previous editions. And what we tried to do was to see whether we can gain any understanding of how different economies try to take the uncertainty that is part of our daily life into consideration and try to align that with the long-term objectives that the country may have, which implies then that needs to decide upon a particular strategy. And as all the panelists said, there is not a single model. In fact, what we see is multiple equilibria, and how and when we will see one equilibrium becoming more dominant than others, it will take a little bit of time.
Right. And the Heinrich IMD Sustainable Trade Index, as you say, itself is not a destination. It is a process of adaptation. If you want to download these resources, the Sustainable Trade Index, the QR code that's flashing up on your screens right now should help you do it. Otherwise, we want to thank Debbie, Simon, Richard, Christos. You have been amazing partners. And
Wei, of course,
for
because he always forgets himself in the end. And let's not repeat the mistake that we done in the beginning.
Thank you all, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.